Good morning. Again. I'll try to be serious now. 4 weeks ago, we began our study in the book, The Story. It's a version of the Bible written in chronological order, and it's paraphrased. So I have chosen to paraphrase. That's why I stammered when Pastor Paul said you are going to do the scripture. In Genesis, we learned that God created the universe. He created mankind to live in this beautiful universe. However, Adam, the first man, was tempted and yielded to evil in the form of a serpent. The serpent lured Adam and Eve into sinning by violating the one prohibition that God gave them for living in the garden. Thus, they destroyed God's original plan for man. Abraham was the first patriarch of the Hebrews. And the Hebrews are also known as Jews or Israelites, or the children of Israel. With the birth of Jacob and Joseph, God had fulfilled a promise that he had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that a great nation would spring from them, and that the Egyptian Pharaoh would be forced to let my people go. Abraham was succeeded by his son Isaac. Isaac's son Jacob became the father of the nation of Israel, and from his 12 sons, the tribes of Israel were established. Unfortunately, the sons of Jacob had little commitment to God, and they did not respond to his call. In fact, they sold their brother Joseph into slavery, and Joseph was then taken to Egypt. There, his righteousness was recognized, and he became a great leader there. Later, during a severe famine, his brothers came to Egypt, and Joseph made sure that they were fed and comforted. In fact, they settled there. After Joseph's death, and for the next 400 years, the Israelites living there were oppressed and enslaved. And until, in desperation, they eventually cried out to God for deliverance. Moses was selected to be God's ambassador to Pharaoh, and his brother Aaron was to serve as God's spokesperson, asking Pharaoh to grant the Israelite people spiritual freedom. When Pharaoh refused, God sent plagues on the Egyptians. Today, I'd like to share about Moses, an 80-year-old, unlikely, and very reluctant leader. This is the man whom God selected to be the deliverer of the Israelites. After the death of Joseph, a new Pharaoh came into power in Egypt, and he resented the prolific increase in the population of the Israelites. So he enslaved them and forced them to perform hard labor with using brick and mortar, and some of them to work hard in the fields. He instructed the midwives to kill all the male babies born to the Israelites. When the midwives refused to do this, Pharaoh gave an edict to throw every male Hebrew baby into the water. Amram and Jochebed, his father's sister, of the tribe of Levi living in Egypt, were married. When their son Moses was born, Jochebed sensed that something special was with this baby. She perceived that it was God's special gift. Acting on faith and obedience, they decided to prepare a vessel, which they constructed and put the baby in the Nile River. They fixed this basket and sealed it with tar so that it would not leak water. They instructed the baby's older sister to place this basket in the water near where Pharaoh's daughter bathed. When hearing the cry of the baby, Pharaoh's daughter came to investigate. Here she discovered a beautiful baby boy. She wanted to keep the baby, but couldn't figure out how to do this. While standing in the water, she verbalized her distress, and Moses' sister offered her a solution. The sister suggested that she tell her father she wanted to give the baby to a Hebrew woman to raise for a while, and then would like to bring him in the palace and raise him as her own. So Pharaoh's daughter took that suggestion and paid the baby's own mother to nurse and care for him, although she did not realize at that time that it was his mother. Later, the boy was taken to the house of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's daughter named him Moses, which means taken from the water. Here Moses received education from the Egyptians, which God had planned so that Moses would have credibility with the Egyptians. The Levites prospered, and Moses was living in the royal palace, but he never forgot his basic initial Hebrew training and values. Through Moses, God delivered to the Hebrew people a leader to pull them from slavery in Egypt and also to give them the law. As an adult, Moses saw an Egyptian slave master beating a Jewish slave. Moses looked around, thinking no one was watching. He rescued the slave, but killed the Egyptian. He thought that the Jews would embrace him, but they didn't. Feeling estranged from them and fearing reprisal from Pharaoh, he fled into the desert. Moses' motivation was right, but his methods and timing were altogether wrong. He ran for his life away from his people to the land of Midian. In a chance encounter at the well there, Moses saw the 7 daughters of Reuel, who was the priest of Midian. It's easier to call him Jethro, and the Bible calls him both names, so I'll go with Jethro. His daughters had come to fill their water vessels and were waiting in line for the well to open. Shepherds came along and tried to push ahead of the ladies. Moses intervened and chased them away. He remained in Midian for a time and actually married one of Jethro's daughters. There he became a shepherd, guarding his father-in-law's flock. The cruel king of Egypt had died, and the Israelites groaned in their slavery. They cried out to God for their deliverance. God heard their groaning and grumbling, and due to his compassion and faithfulness in keeping that promise that he had made to Abraham centuries ago, he confronted Moses while Moses was out in the fields in the form of a burning bush. It was on Mount Oreb. God spoke to this 80-year-old Moses and commanded him to return to the city and approach the Pharaoh. God commissioned him to be his ambassador to the Pharaoh, and Moses' 83-year-old brother Aaron was commissioned to be the spokesperson. Although Moses felt very unworthy for this task, he returned to Egypt, and he and Aaron went before the Pharaoh as instructed. They pleaded for the Pharaoh to let the Israelites go back to the land of Canaan, from whence they had come centuries earlier. At first, Pharaoh refused, but later Moses and Aaron reluctantly approached Pharaoh again, stating God's message was that he should allow the Israelites to return to Egypt. After witnessing many miraculous acts, one of which Moses turned his rod into snakes, the Nile River turned into blood, leaving the Egyptians without any clean water to drink. Frogs, lice, gnats, and insects swarmed over Egypt, and the Egyptians' animals were becoming sick. And the final plague, the firstborn sons of Egyptian parents were killed by God's angel. But the firstborn sons in the households of the Israelites were spared, because they displayed blood of a sacrificial lamb over the door frame. And the locusts were still swarming, so Pharaoh reluctantly agreed to let the Hebrew people go. Later, Pharaoh changed his mind, and after the Hebrews had departed, Pharaoh sent armies behind them to capture them and return them back to Egypt. While the Israelites were traveling toward the Promised Land, they had no food or water. Moses was commanded by God to strike his rod upon one of the rocks at Mount Horeb. And miraculously, when he did this, water appeared. As Moses' people groaned with hunger, God sent manna in the morning, and it was a wafer-like bread that supposedly tasted like honey. And they were able to eat it raw. They could cook it, they could grind it into meal, and bake it for other purposes. In the evening, quail appeared and was eaten for dinner. For 5 mornings, the Israelites were told to gather as much manna as they actually needed for just that day. On the 6th day, they were instructed to gather twice as much as they needed for the day, and instructed to bake it or boil it if they wished, because the next day was the Sabbath day. And the Holy Sabbath, on the Holy Sabbath, they were to rest. Later, when the Amalekites came to fight them, Moses raised that same rod, and the Amalekites lost the battle. When Moses had his group of over 2 million people lined up on the banks of the Red Sea, they were pondering how to cross it. Suddenly, the sea dried up, and those people in one single file line, and one biblical scholar said it stretched for 50 miles, one person up against the water. While they were lining up, the sea suddenly dried up, and the whole band, maybe 2,000 people, were able to march forward across the Red Sea, only to look back when they were safely on the other side to see the Egyptian troops that were chasing them drowning in the water. The water had quickly returned to the sea. Actually, it was Moses' parents who wanted to save him as a baby, but it was God's providence that actually did. It seemed unlikely that he would do so, for Moses had murdered a man. Moses had then fled to a foreign land and married a foreigner. All men are fallible, even men and women of faith. No matter how spiritually high we become, there will always be spiritual lows in our life. Knowing this should help us weather the storms of life and failures of others, as well as the failures of ourselves. God has not chosen to save perfect people, because perfect people don't need to be saved. Instead, through God's grace, he has chosen to take imperfect people and over time make them more like him. Therefore, we should not be surprised when people of faith fail. We often suffer unnecessarily from unrealistic expectations, both for ourselves and for others. Let us remember that our standing before God, our salvation, our sanctification, and our service is all a matter of his grace, not our goodness nor our works. God's work is often unseen or undetected by men at the time of the outworking. Every detail of our lives, every incident, every failure is employed by God providentially for his purposes. And this should assure us that even when we fail, he does not. While we wait to discern his will in regard to our petitions and prayers by focusing on our relationship with him, acknowledging who he is, choosing to follow his plan, we will find joy and satisfaction for our lives. Even though there are times when it doesn't appear that God hears or answers our prayer, he is at work, always faithful, and he will respond, but in his time. Sometimes God calls us to do something we feel uncomfortable doing, or to accomplish a task which we feel is impossible. Even though we feel unqualified and unprepared, we can, and we should, always yield to the wisdom of God. He chooses people who are willing and obedient to follow his plan, no matter what they would prefer to do. God gives them the courage, the opportunity, the strength, and endurance to carry out his plan. God is not bound by our expectations, and we can't predict what he is going to call us to do. However, in every case, he will provide us with whatever is needed to complete the assignment, if only we trust him. Perhaps you feel enslaved today by a person, a circumstance, or a situation that seems impossible to change. Remember, you are not in control. If you tell him your concerns and desires, yield to him, and follow as he guides, you can be certain that you will cross over your own Red Sea, no matter how wide it is.